Hello and welcome back. In the last video we talked about how to select objects. Now we're going to talk about how to manipulate them. Over here on the left hand column we talked about these three selection modes. The next three buttons are the Move tool, Rotate tool, and Scale tool. These are the basic translation functions that will allow you to shift and shuffle things around in your scene. So if I click on the Move tool, you'll notice that I get what's called a manipulator. It's just a little helper object in the display that allows you to move this object in 3 dimensions. So if you'll notice, it stays the same size no matter if I zoom in or zoom out. So relatively it gets smaller and larger compared to my object, but as far as the screen size that it's taking up, it doesn't shrink or grow. If I wanted my manipulator to be bigger, for example, I can just tap the plus button and the manipulator gets large. I can tap the minus button to make it smaller and it can get pretty small. But I like it about that size. So you'll notice there's 3 different arrows and they're all different colors, red, green, and blue. So RGB, red, green, blue, gives you the axis that you're working on. The red one is the X, the green one is the Y axis, and the blue arrow is the Z axis. RGB, XYZ. Now when I select an arrow, it turns yellow. That means that that arrow is the active move direction. So when I'm ready to move my object in that direction, I just click and drag that arrow and slide the object along the axis. If I want it to go in another direction, I can click and drag that arrow and it'll slide perfectly along the Z axis. If I want it to move up and down, I click and drag the vertical axis or the Y axis and move the object along the pathway of that arrow. Now these squares out here allow me to drag the object in 2 dimensions. These are the 2 axes perpendicular to the one opposite them. So you'll notice the red arrow has a square perpendicular to it, which is red. So if I want to drag along the x-axis, I click that arrow. But if I want to drag perpendicular in 2 dimensions to the x-axis, then I can click the red square and move it up and down, side to side in 2 dimensions. Same with the blue. So this is the z-axis, and this is the square that's perpendicular to that, which allows me to move it in 2 dimensions, up, down, diagonally, along a flat plane that's perpendicular to the z-axis. And the same is true for the y-axis. When I want to move it along the ground plane in 2 dimensions, I can grab that square. One more thing about the Move tool is this little yellow square right in the middle. You'll notice no matter where I turn, that square is facing me, facing my view, and it's still a square. At the very center of that Move tool, I can move my object perpendicular to my camera view. So this allows me to move my view around to a place that I want to see the object and then move the object in relation to my own view. And it allows me greater freedom of movement. So that's the Move manipulator, and you'll be using this all the time because it's very handy. Alright, the next button here on the left is the Rotate tool. This gives us these different colored rings, and all you do is click one of the rings and drag them in order to rotate the object. Again, you have 3 dimensions, so you can rotate your object along any of those 3 dimensions, X, Y, Z, RGB. This red ring is going to rotate the object about the X axis. The green ring, which will turn yellow as soon as I select it or hover over it, will rotate this object about the Y axis, the vertical axis. And the blue ring, which also turns yellow, will rotate the object about the Z axis. So you can rotate the object in 3 different dimensions. You also have a camera-based rotate, which is this outer ring. It's light blue, but it turns yellow when I click on it. And that similarly will allow me to rotate any object that's selected based on my camera view of that object, which is really useful. The next tool here is the Scale tool. Scale tool gives you a manipulator similar to the Move tool, but instead of arrows you have these little cubes at the center and each end. When I click on one cube, I'm scaling in only 1 dimension. So that begins to distort your geometry. You can flatten it out. I can also scale in 2 dimensions perpendicular, like a football or submarine shape, and I can also scale in 3 dimensions at once, which is the center cube, no matter how I'm looking at the object, will give me a perfectly uniform scale in 3 dimensions. So you have Move, Rotate, Scale. The hotkeys for these are very important. You'll be using them a lot. If you're using your mouse with your right hand, you'll have your left hand on the keyboard, W, E, R. And you'll find that since Q is the hotkey for the Select tool, you can keep your hand there on the keyboard, Q, W, E, R, T. T is the last tool used, but Q, W, E, R allows you to select, move, rotate, scale. So I use those all the time. One thing that's interesting about the Rotate tool, if you open the tool settings, you have a check checkbox that's called Discrete Rotate. Discrete Rotate allows you to rotate the object snapped to an angle. So right now it's a 45-degree rotation, which allows me to rotate in 2 steps a perfect 90 degrees. I can change the degree of that rotation to just 5, for example, and then I can rotate the object 5 degrees at a time so that I can get precise measurements. So that's Discrete Rotate. It's in the Tool Settings menu, which can be toggled on and off with this button with the wrench on it. As I'm moving my objects around, I might find that I want more than one of them. I can easily duplicate an object by pressing Command D, and that'll duplicate the object in the exact place of the other one. So now I have 2 of these spheres. Duplicate again. I can duplicate 3 at a time. Now I have 6. So you see, you can very quickly begin to create an army of objects in your scene just by duplicating them. If I find I have too many, I can just delete 1 or 2 or 3 by clicking to select and pushing the delete key. How easy is that? Okay, in the next video, we're going to talk about how to get into an object and select the faces and edges and vertices of that object and begin manipulating those.